Hi, everyone. Um, so we are going to start the webinar now. I'll give you a brief introduction to our research network. So Caste's Practice is a research network that arose from a reading group we have been running in the Department of Sociology for several months. And the central question we have been asking is why caste persists in every domain of life in India and beyond? What explains its tenacity and why, despite so much political, social, and economic transformation, caste continues to morph and remain entrenched? So we are seeking to develop a critical sociology of caste that avoids essentialism. We don't see caste as a pre-given entity, but as a contingent and historically evolved formation that has deep relevance to every aspect of the South Asian life. While we are seeking to understand the ongoing contemporary evolution of caste, we are also revisiting older debates. The CRASSH Research Network has taken up this question through different sessions. Today, we are exploring caste through texts, especially looking at the tension between caste's normative dimensions and its lived dimensions. So we have three distinguished speakers today. Professor John Keune is Associate Professor of Religious Studies at the Michigan State University. He's a scholar of religion, society, and trans-regionalism, working especially in Western India as well as Taiwan and Japan. His major works include Shared Devotion, Shared Food, Equality, and the Bhakti caste question in Western India, and a co-edited volume called Regional Communities of Devotion in South Asia, Insiders, Outsiders, and Interlopers. Our second guest speaker is Professor Ananya Vajpeyi. So Professor Vajpeyi is fellow at the Center for the Study of Developing Societies and works at the intersection of intellectual history, political theory, and critical philology. She's completing a book about the modern life of Sanskrit for W.W. Norton. Her major works include Righteous Republic, The Political Foundations of Modern India, and more recently, a co-edited volume, Minorities and Populism, Critical Perspectives from South Asia and Europe. And our own Dr. Ankur Barua is a senior lecturer in Hindu Studies at the Faculty of Divinity, University of Cambridge. He's published several academic monographs on interreligious relationships and has now turned his attention to writing novels. He published his first novel, The Harvest of Time, in 2023 as part of a trilogy. So let me welcome our first speaker, Professor Keune, to share his thoughts with us.
Sure, thank you very much. So I'll be the first speaker and not Ananya? Totally fine with me.
I think in our list, you were the first speaker. So
Okay,
if it's fine
fantastic.
with you.
Okay.
Or if Ananya wants to go first, that's also totally possible.
I know. I mean, I had the list I received indicated that I was the first, but it doesn't matter to me if it doesn't matter to John.
Please go ahead, Ananya.
Yes, please go ahead. Please go ahead.
Okay. Well, hello and thank you, Ankur and other colleagues in Cambridge, for inviting me to participate in this discussion. I was in a discussion like this, very much like this, but that was pre-pandemic. It was at CRASSH, it was in person, and at this point it feels like something that happened in the deep past, much like many of the things we'll be discussing today. So by way of preface, I want to say that over the past 25 years, from the time I was a doctoral researcher to the present, my work on caste has traversed different aspects of the pre-modern and the modern, the textual and the contextual, the normative and the experiential, the prescriptive and the descriptive, the theoretical and the critical. I hope you're able to hear me. The question is, what counts as a text and what counts as its context? For example, for my doctoral dissertation, I studied several Dharma Shastra digests on Shudra Dharma, mostly written from the 15th to the 17th centuries, in Sanskrit in Banaras and Mithila. One type of context where these texts, their authors, the genre of the Dharma Nibandha, and the topic of Shudra Dharma could be placed was the moment of the creation of the Maratha polity under Shivaji. A key actor in this setting was somebody by the name of Gaga Bhatt, a Shudra Dharma expert of Maharashtrian extraction from a scholarly family settled in Banaras over many generations. He performed Shivaji's Rajyabhisheka and helped legitimize Shivaji's found genealogy, which connected him to the Sisodia Rajputs. So, strongman Shivaji Bhosale's moment of transformation into Chhatrapati Shivaji Maharaj, Kshatriya king who would rival and challenge Shahenshah Aurangzeb Alamgir in Delhi, was a historical and political context where the category of the Shudra could be shown to have come into salience, contestation, reinterpretation, and ultimately erasure. The tumultuous historical life of this social category could then be followed in the specific regional context of Maharashtra, from the Marathas to the Peshwas to the colonial period to Jyotiba Phule and finally to Dr. B.R. Ambedkar. And this exactly was the arc of my own dissertation, 1650, the coronation of Shivaji, to 1950, the constitution of Ambedkar. But there was another context too, that of the production of these Shudra Dharma texts. This was 17th century Banaras, where such texts, like many others, were composed by Sanskrit Pandits, many of whom belonged to Marathi families that had migrated from Paithan to Kashi several centuries before, who specialized in Dharmashastra and Mimamsa, and whose hermeneutic practice took them back to normative debates about Varna, Jati, and Dharma in the vast Smriti, Shastra, Purana, and Itihasa literature. For these Pandits, their textual tradition itself provided the context that they considered most significant for their claims and arguments, rather than the historical reality, so to speak, in which they lived. For all around them were the facts of Muslim political power, Sufi religiosity, Persianate courtly conventions, rising vernacular languages, and a multicultural cosmopolitanism that gave little credence to Brahminical notions of who is high and who is low. But judging from the texts that these pundits wrote, you would never be able to extrapolate any of this historical context. In recent years, I have examined other more recent historical contexts too for these texts of Shudra Dharma and the category of the Shudra. For example, their uptake by Ambedkar at some length in his work, his book from 1946, for example, Who Were the Shudras? But I'm not going to go into it today because I think we are trying to stay focused on a pre colonial period. So, staying with the Sanskrit sources but moving out of the genre of the Dharma Shastra, I have looked at Shudra and outcast characters in the narrative and didactic literature, particularly in the Upanishads, in the epics, and in some of the Kavya and Nataka literary texts. Increasingly, I have come to see many key characters, not so much as Shudra in the strict Dharmashastric sense of the term, but rather as forest dwellers, pastoralists, tribals, occasionally renunciants and ascetics, or women, those who are outside of or marginal relative to urban and agrarian caste society. The social identities of such characters, mediated through literary tropes, of course, cannot be accurately captured within the normative framework of Varnashrama Dharma and the juridical language of the Dharma Shastra. Rather, they function according to different rules, those of literature, whether it's Sahitya or Kavya or Itihasa. So I have in mind figures like Shambhuka and Ekalavya, Satyakama and Janashruti, Vidura and Kirata, and so on. They definitely queer the pitch for our Dharma experts sitting in Banaras and advising Shivaji on how to become a king despite his uncertain family background and problematic social placement. Most recently, I have begun to move out of Sanskrit into early Hindi, exploring what poets like Kabir, Raidas, and Dadu contribute to our understanding of caste. These poets, as is well known, radically destabilize the accepted correlation between social status and spiritual liberation, thereby disrupting the power knowledge nexus that we call Brahmin hegemony. Tulsidas, in whom I'm actually most interested, has a complicated position in the Bhakti canon, being at once a Brahmin himself, yet ostracized by the Banaras Pandits among whom he lived and wrote, but also populating his Ramcharitmanas with fascinating outcast characters like Shabari and Kag Bhushundi, who either have a very minimal role or do not appear at all in Valmiki's Ramayana. Now, I personally haven't begun to historicize the Bhakti poetry of North India that is more or less contemporaneous with my Shudra Dharma texts, with respect to, say, the Mughal or the Rajput political context of its production. I'm thinking here of a huge area from Rajasthan to eastern UP, from Punjab to Madhya Pradesh. But that sort of historicization too would be necessary in order to have an even better understanding of what work a category like Shudra is actually doing in the 17th century over an altogether very large trans-regional, multilingual, and culturally complex historical space. So, with this introduction, I'm going to move on now to the specific questions that you all have raised and that you sent to us as a list. The first of these questions is, to what extent is the motif of shared devotion in pre modern bhakti worlds translatable to, quote, social equality in the contemporary sense of this notion? So, here's my answer. Bhakti poetry and its poets have been completely absorbed into discourses of emancipation in modern India and are seen as the indigenous precursors to the struggle for equality that comes to a head in the anti-colonial movement. This is true for the way Bhakti is read all over India in many different languages and with distinct traditions of egalitarian struggle, whether religious, social, or political. As I mentioned, I've been exploring Bhakti poets from North India broadly, from the west across the Indo Gangetic Plain to the east, together with other scholars. So I participate in two groups. One is at CSDS, my home institution, and within that, at what we call the Parekh Institute for Indian Thought. And the other one is a reading group in classical Hindi, which is convened by Imre Banga out of Oxford. So we have been looking at a variety of traditions, including the Kabir Panth, the Dadu Panth, the Raidasya Samaj, the Sikh Panth, Sufi poets, as well as Vaishnav poets, Bhakti poets, whether of those who follow Krishna or those who follow Ram. And I think their radicalism in their own times and places genuinely lends itself to empowering movements for social equality and social justice, even in contemporary India. And we see this everywhere. And I think this is equally true in the South with the Southern languages, whether Tamil or Kannada or Malayalam. I mean, I myself can't read these, but this much is quite clear from the literature. My feeling is that your question actually arises because in left-leaning traditions of thinking about equality in India, in South Asia, people don't like the idea of devotion. The moment there is a whiff of religious sentiment, many of those who are involved in struggles against caste become very suspicious, right? And this is also incidentally the source of many attacks on Gandhi, whether by Ambedkarites or others. But without going into who's right and who's wrong, um, I just want to say that Bhakti does provide an important tradition of emancipatory and critical thought within the Indian context. And many modern social movements are able to get a lot from it. Bhakti as devotionalism and bhakti as radicalism need not always be on the warpath, as they can often be, especially from a Marxist perspective. Second, your question. Should we read presentations of caste in canonical texts such as the Dharma Shastras as normative idealizations or as descriptive accounts? Now, this is a large subject. And in my view, Dharma Shastra is at the end of the day a Shastra. That is to say, it is intended to be normative and not descriptive by the very definition of this genre. Reading Dharma Shastra as though it were ethnographic or sociological or experiential or historical is a basic epistemological error. And it's quite common in, especially in Indology, if not in sociology and in, in the social sciences. To my mind, any scholarship which proceeds from this false premise cannot help us at all in terms of developing any kind of thick description of social realities and their power dynamics, especially in the past. Without paying heed to all of the different types of intratextual, intertextual, and contextual environments in which texts, including Dharma Shastra texts, live and are meaningful, we cannot make sense of Dharma Shastra. And in fact, I would go so far as to say most of all Dharma Shastra, more than any of the other Shastras and Shastric disciplines, because this is the Shastra, after all, of Dharma, which is nothing if not the normative as such. Your third question. With respect to your field of research, in what ways has the category of caste, in brackets Varna or Jati, operated at the intersection of symbolic imagination and social location? So this is where I would place my readings of the Shudra characters from the epics, etc. Literary texts, and especially poetic texts, have a profound capacity to question, criticize, reject, transcend, and transform social categories, and to unseat the political and legal frameworks that try to institute and enforce social hierarchy. There's a reason why Bhakti is articulated in poetry. Let poetry be a sword, as D.R. Nagraj said. I can attest that characters like the Shudra ascetic Shambhuka, the Nishada prince Ekalavya, the female ascetic Shabari, the immortal crow Kakbhushundi, not only sometimes inspire movements for social emancipation far beyond their immediate narrative setting, but even within the text where they occur, they provide entry points that allow an apparently conservative tradition to reflect upon, critique, and potentially subvert the dominant interpretation of that text itself. So these characters, in a sense, offer us openings. They function like mines, you could say, that trigger an explosive expansion of the text's meaning far beyond the limited circumference of the prescriptions or proscriptions of Varnashrama Dharma. Speaking for myself personally, I treat the symbolic order of the epics as seriously as the normative discourse of the Manusmriti, sometimes even more so, because the epics at the end of the day are accessible to all, not just to expert Brahmin interpreters or their politically powerful clients. Of course, if we go to poets who themselves are from socially marginal positions, like Kabir or Raidas, you will find them questioning not just Chatur Varnya, but destabilizing a range of social and semantic binaries: Hindu, Muslim, Sagun, Nirgun, male, female, Brahmin, Chandala, Vaishnav, Shaiva, and so on. The creative way in which they deploy metaphors stretches or breaks not only linguistic boundaries but also social boundaries. This is what accounts for the fact that they are remembered and revered centuries later in both oral and written literature, preserved as much through popular memory as through scholarly exegesis, canonized through sectarian followings as well as appropriated by political parties, their ideas proliferating across many arts and many media, and even today, so longer after their own time, often considered too hot to handle. Finally, looking ahead, what do you consider to be promising areas for future research in this field of caste between text and context, especially for young scholars attending the session today? So, my answer here is very brief because I expect that this part of the answer will actually take up time when those young scholars start to ask questions more directly. So, what I want to say for now is just very little and quite elliptical. Um, which is to say, and I'm totally reflecting our current political environment, not only in India, but globally, that if the left has failed, and if liberal democracy has failed, and if Hinduism has gone rogue in some sense through majoritarianism and religious nationalism, then we have little choice but to turn to the literary, social, and philosophical traditions available to us that have long debated and critiqued caste and thought deeply about fundamental questions of justice, morality, and freedom that affect human societies. If you are handling caste creatively and carefully in your work as scholars, I say to those among us who are just starting out, it can prove to be one of the most productive ways of reading many different texts and contexts within the pre colonial as well as the modern history of South Asia. So that's it for me for my prepared remarks. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ananya. We cannot clap, but I think I would like to, sort of representing the rest of the crowd. So, Professor Keune, would you like to come in next?
Sure, I'd be happy to. Thank you, Ananya,
Thank you.
for that very, very interesting presentation. And thank you all for inviting me to join this panel. Caste as Practice looks like a great series of panels, and I applaud you for putting it together. I especially appreciate today's session being framed in terms of text and context. To me, in my work, this especially highlights the social function of texts and discourses, in addition to what they might mean. One thread that runs through all of my India-based research and some of my work in Japan is to explore how religious groups have sought to practically transcend caste. And usually this is met with quite limited success. So I come at this feeling a little bit, in some ways, pessimistic, with wanting to recognize the emancipatory potential that is within these ways of thinking. And so I'm also very interested in considering how we set up the question and criteria to evaluate success at all, especially if a negative judgment leads us to overlook changes that the communities did accomplish, but didn't quite match up to what we think social equality is. Very briefly, I'd note that currently, for the past several years, in fact, I've been working on transnational Buddhism and Ambedkarite migration, especially beyond India since the 1990s, with ethnographic work in India, Japan, Dubai, the UK, Western Europe, and North America. And I'm very much observing there what Ambedkarites see as Buddhism, what Buddhism means and does for them, especially in international contexts as they reckon with different visions of Buddhism, and how Ambedkarites configure anti-caste struggles when they're living in societies where caste is not as normative and they're living among people for whom caste is something that's sort of mysterious. So that's what I'm working at, especially right now. But defining text in that case has some other complications, and it doesn't really fit our theme so well today. So I'm going to put that aside in this presentation, but it is in the background. What I'm going to talk about is instead 3 scenarios of Marathi Bhakti, and I'm thinking especially of the Warkari Sampradaya, the largest Bhakti group in Maharashtra, for considering text and context of caste. These 3 scenarios are the pre-modern Marathi Bhakti worlds, poetry and hagiography, and especially how they engage with non-dualist thought alongside other intellectual paradigms. The second is modern reconceptualization of Bhakti in the late 19th and early 20th century in terms of social equality, using that word specifically. And then the third instance that I'll look at a little bit more briefly is a group that arose in the 1920s in the eastern side of Maharashtra, in what's now Vidarbha, which is a self-consciously anti-caste group coming out of the Warkari Sampradaya called the Ajat Samaj, the people who have no jati. So those 3 things will be orienting my presentation. So to start with, the pre-modern Bhakti of the Warkari Sampradaya. The Warkaris are sort of well known for having a constellation of saints from a variety of backgrounds, including women, Shudras, and Dalits from the 13th to the 17th centuries, and a very large follower base, especially among agriculturalists in Maharashtra, so predominantly not Brahmin. The poetry of the Warkaris includes a lot of caste-critical messages reflecting their own positions, especially when these poets are Shudras and Dalits, and we find this in many other places around South Asia. My focus has been the Saint Eknath from the 16th century, who was an intellectual, but in many ways unorthodox Brahmin, and so in this way sort of interestingly comparable to what Ananya was talking about with Tulsidas. Eknath was also from Paitan, the same place as the Marathi families in Varanasi that Ananya mentioned. So Paitan is sort of a center of Brahmin orthodoxy, but Eknath went a little bit different path and doesn't seem to have come from any of the families that then went into the more Dharmashastric route. Eknath's known for composing some philosophical works, including commentarial renderings of parts of the Bhagavata Purana and the Ramayana. So he was engaged with that, although the intellectual side, so far as we remember or we know, does not seem to be the main thing that he was engaged in. He composed thousands of short, more devotional poems to the local god Vittal, which is a form of Krishna, and so sometimes he was writing these to Krishna as well. Included among these poems were some 300 allegorical drama poems, or bharuds. Some of these were in the style of official Persianate letters, probably reflecting his own occupational background, at least for a time. But most remarkable, I think, are 60 bharuds that were staged in the voice of Dalits. And these Dalit figures then very often are speaking back to Brahmins and sometimes challenging them. So there's a complex, Eknath as a Brahmin is writing in the voice of a Dalit, and there's a complexity here. But his Brahminness is still very central, I think, in his self-presentation and what he writes. So historically, Eknath was surely a very complicated character. But most intriguing to me are the hagiographical stories that emerged around him and how they changed over time. How people remembered him in a more popular way, I think, is recorded more in the hagiography than his texts themselves. There are a lot of episodes in which Eknath interacts respectfully with Mahars, the largest Dalit group in Maharashtra, including one in which he, or possibly an image of him, this is strategically, I think, left ambiguous, in which he eats at a Mahar couple's home, takes food from them, and creates a stir in the community. So caste transgression is a major theme throughout the hagiography of Eknath. Some story renditions highlight Eknath's acquiescence to Brahmin critics and undergoing purification. So there is this sort of double doing something that's very challenging, but then also acquiescing to caste. The hagiographers that are dealing with these stories then end up negotiating between their depiction of Eknath justifying his actions and also then conceding to Brahmin authority. So the ways that they sometimes do this is to say that Eknath sees no differences or acts with impartiality towards all people. And so terms that are often used are samadrishti, sort of a vision of impartiality, samabhava, an impartial feeling, or occasionally samata, something like impartialness. We can maybe translate equality, which people did in the 19th century, but I'm not sure that that's what this means in the pre-colonial times. So some main arguments about this research on pre-modern Bhakti that I've got are that however we interpret a saint's writings, hagiography indicates more the reception history of how the saint is remembered, and I think on a more popular level, because the saint's writings, especially in a more philosophical realm, has a more limited readership. And what we think about a saint's thought based on our reading of the saint's own compositions or things that were composed pseudonymously in the saint's name is not the same as the significance of what the followers actually perceived. So that's why I think the hagiography is especially important. It's valuable to observe hagiography changing over time in order to notice fractures and discomforts in the narratives. What might seem peculiar in one rendition, if we limit ourselves to only one rendition of a story, can, I think, be helpfully contextualized narratologically when we read multiple renditions across each other together. And this can, I think, help reveal some historical context for the texts, especially in the absence of other evidence. So thinking about these as popular movements among non-elite peoples who are not by and large being registered in official sort of historical documents and narratives, we otherwise don't have a lot of historical knowledge about these groups. And hagiography can get a little bit in that direction if we read it very carefully. So I think this helps us start to sense what stories we're doing for authors and audiences and not just what they mean. So another thing that I would say as a takeaway is that when viewed over centuries, I noticed a pattern in the controversial stories about Eknath, especially regarding strategic ambiguity. For example, the story of commensality of Eknath eating at the Mahar couple's home. There were slight adjustments to that story, but all of them preserved something of a mystery. The story goes that Eknath was invited to the home. He accepts. Brahmins get upset. Some go and witness him eating at the Mahar couple's homes, but then some other Brahmins witness him eating at his own home at the same time. So two images of Eknath, and then there's the question, well, how did that happen? And hagiographers offered different sorts of arguments for that, but they really did preserve the mystery. And I think that is really important in the story. It leaves the question open. Did Eknath actually eat at the Dalit couple's home? That was intentionally left vague. So I think this ambiguity is an effect of hagiographers attempting to speak to a multi-caste audience in a way that allows different people and groups to interpret it in ways that suit them, rather than radically challenging or rejecting one view and potentially alienating part of their audience. So I think this is part of a strategy. So third, on a system level of hagiography, about many saints together, I think we can see what I call an ideology of inclusive differentiation, in the sense that Bhakti movements do tend to be inclusive, but then in preserving caste identities, which I think not only is an accident, but maybe even must be preserved, this demonstrates the grace of God. So this movement of inclusion also has a conservative side to it, even if that was not the original intention. So, and fourth, food is a major site of caste transgression in the Warkari tradition, and I expect in other ones as well, where we can see competing value systems clash. And so I suggest that we could look at something called critical commensality and expect that when we come into atmospheres where food is being eaten together, we can start to detect social tensions, different value systems, and things like that on local emic terms rather than just sort of social scientific terms. So since the book that I published in 2021, I've been thinking more about the need for something like an anthropology of non-dualism. So, and I'm thinking of anthropology here in the sense of like Melford Spiro and David Gellner's idea of an anthropology of Buddhism. So rather than thinking about the abstract system, looking at what people actually do with it. So the question of non-dualist thought and caste, I find, is sort of oddly persistent, and sort of people keep kind of questioning, well, did people who are advocating for non-dualist positions actually critique the caste system, as if somehow intellectually understanding non-dualism necessarily was going to provide us an insight into people's behavior. And if we haven't achieved that intellectual understanding yet, therefore we don't understand their position on caste. I would say the better approach is to observe non-dualist advocates' actual actions and situate what this non-dualist discourse does, and bring more context into the reading of non-dualist texts, both in their Sanskrit and their vernacular diversity. I think Bhakti texts offer a provocative example for this. So the second piece that I'd like to talk about, modern reconceptualization in late 19th and early 20th centuries, in relation to the term social equality. The term social equality has a recent history. It's tied to political transformations in Western Europe and the US, especially the idea of equality before the law and the Constitution. But even there, the term equality, when it's envisioned, is always still within parameters. It's not equality for everybody. And so we often kind of forget that. This idea enters Marathi discourse, so far as I can tell, with Jyotiba Phule in the 19th century. When he cites Thomas Paine, he's writing in Marathi and uses the word samata, but I think by that time he's using it in a socio-political sense rather than in a non-dualist sense as it was previously used. Separately, around the same time, Warkari literature is transformed into Marathi literary heritage, and this becomes prized as a non-sectarian cultural resource that all Marathi speakers can be proud of. A few, not all, Maharashtrian social reformers envisioned Bhakti as promoting anti-caste sentiment. Most influentially, Mahadev Govind Ranade's Rise of the Maratha Power, in which he argues that the saints prepared the way for Shivaji by overcoming caste differences. There were some earlier precedents, though. And in this, there's the conflation of samatha as modern social equality with the earlier Marathi non-dualistic sense. I think this was strategic. It enabled a use of the past, but it also made for historiographical problems. The question, did Bhakti traditions promote social equality, becomes natural and logical to ask, but it occludes the fact that this is actually an anachronistic question. And this led Ambedkar to influentially respond, no, it didn't. Bhakti promoted spiritual equality only, and not social equality. And then he urged his followers to abandon Bhakti and Hinduism generally and convert to Buddhism. Overshadowed in this, I think, are some efforts by Vittal Ramji Shinde, who was a missionary of the Satyashodak Samaj for a while and then founds the Depressed Classes Mission. Based on my fieldwork in Vidarbha, I think this Bhakti social equality connection did actually have some effects among multiple socially marginalized groups, including Dalits, but this was quickly eclipsed by Ambedkar and his predominantly Mahar movement in Maharashtra. Finally, I'd say just a bit about the Ajat Samaj, founded by a man named Hari Bhabhutkar, also known as Ganpati Maharaj, in the early 20s in the town of Mangul Dastagir between Warada and Amravati in Vidarbha. He was a Warkari Maharaj leader who became self-consciously an anti-caste Samaj Sudharak. He used that word himself. He was banished from the Vittal temple that he had helped to set up, but then he established a community of his own across the street. He advocated for radical change among his followers. They only wear white, they carry a white flag, they abandon caste and adopt Ajat as their last name, so not having a jati. He advocated that they all join in a ritual kala, Varkari sort of common meal, shared food. In his version of it, people would all contribute food together. It would all be put in a large pot. It would be mixed up, and then lumps of food would be distributed to each other so no one could understand or discern where the food had come from. And most radically, the idea was that people would permit Ganpati Maharaj to arrange their intercaste marriages. This is a sensitive topic, but my sense is that most members were most likely Dalit and low caste and Adivasi by background. The community shunned this group in the town. Some police interventions were documented to ward off attacks against the group. Later, the Ganpati Maharaj disappeared for a few years and then returned with a second wife, which alienated some members of the society, including one of his own sons, who objected and split off and formed his own group. Ganpati Maharaj was never the same afterwards, lived somewhat of a reclusive life, and perhaps, according to members in the community, struggled something with like mental health, although that would not have been the category that they talked about at the time. The community still continues today. In 2005, they brought a case to government officials in Nagpur asking that Ajat be added to the scheduled caste list and that they be granted reservation status. After that was denied, some members began recovering the paperwork and re-registering their original scheduled caste names. So there's no ambiguity about this group endorsing an anti-caste position. They explicitly did so on modern terms. But here too, trying to abolish caste came at a high price, subject to external forces. There were social pressures from the community, and the reservation system was very attractive to get them back into the caste system. So in conclusion, I just make a few takeaway points. One, the apparently caste-critical Bhakti discourse, I think, we need to appreciate a speech act. And we should be paying attention to what social function and not only the meaning these texts had. And this is where I would say an anthropology of non-dualist thought would be helpful. When we refer, second, to social equality, we should be very clear about what exactly we mean by it. Are we attempting to directly translate pre-modern Indic terminology? If so, I'm not sure social equality works. In fact, I don't think it does. Or are we using social equality as a shorthand for something that is critiquing caste and social hierarchy, regardless of what exactly their positive vision of the end goal was? In that case, then it can work as long as we recognize that social equality carries a lot of baggage with it. Third, if we judge Bhakti traditions as not achieving equality, we overlook other social changes that were also still significant, as Bhakti groups never actually attempted, I think, to aspire anachronistically to social equality. That was not a term that was in their vocabulary and something that they were striving for. The critique was there, but the idea of equality, I think, also thinking in Western context, is not so much the goal. And then finally, religious anti-caste and caste-critical groups still faced larger external forces that made it difficult and maybe impossible to completely abandon caste. So thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, John, for these thoughts. There's a lot to think about there. Dr. Barua, would you come and take the lead now?
Hello, everyone. I'm going to work with a PPT, and because I don't want to keep on shifting on and off between the PPT and the screen view, I'll just keep the PPT on, the slides on. Let me just see if I can get it right. Okay, I think you should be able to see the PPT. So thank you, John and Ananya, for starting off this discussion. And now, in about 15 minutes again, I'm going to share with you some of my reflections on the messy middle between scriptural horizons of projected equality and sociological realities of entrenched hierarchy. We could summarize this disjunction between text and context as equality promised but interrupted. Alternatively, this is the disjunction between what scripture proclaims and what sociology delivers. Now, I'm interested in this disjunction for two reasons. One is academic, and the other is, for lack of a better term, psychobiographical. Regarding the first reason, in my published research, I have been exploring how the motive of caste is a flashpoint of conflict across Hindu Christian and Hindu Muslim borderlines of conversion. I will return to the second reason towards the end of this talk. Now, to make things slightly more complicated, the disjunction I indicated turns up even within two broad segments of scripture itself. So certain verses from the Upanishads speak in the language of sameness that is rooted in the spiritual self. Atman, for instance, the Katha Upanishad declares that there is no difference here at all, which can be taken as a declaration that socio-ritual inscriptions are not salient or relevant on the spiritual quest. On the other hand, multiple Dharma Sutra and Dharma Shastra texts, such as the Manusmriti itself, prescribe societally differentiated eligibilities, adhikara, and duties, jati dharma and sri dharma, based on hierarchies of gender and caste, varna jati. At the heart of these social-religious visions is the concept of dharma, a polyvalent term with meanings such as order, custom, duty, ethics, and so on. The regimented formulations of dharma in the Dharma Shastra literature often reflect the socially elitist and the androcentric presuppositions of their male Brahmin authors. In their socio-cosmic mapping, it is by fulfilling this worldly dharma that an individual maintains the primordial dharma, that in turn sustains their everyday existence marked by gender and caste. The Brahmin authors articulate an idealized order of Varna Ashrama with themselves at the social ritual summit. Thus, the Manusmriti prescribes, as we know, differentially structured activities for the four Varnas, and the Shudras would gain virtue, dharma, by serving the three progressively higher Varnas. Now, if these Hindu scriptural narratives and symbolic universes express a vision of what we may call sociological austerity, others express a vision of what we may call spiritual abundance. Thus, in traditions centered around the ideal of world renunciation, the renunciant sannyasi is said to transcend all hierarchical structures of dharmic roles. Thus, the sannyasi, strictly speaking, has no varna and is said to look at all beings with the eye of spiritual equality. Now, there are multiple universes of Vedanta to have operated with a conceptual contrast between an individual's spiritual identity rooted in the Atman beyond all inscriptions of caste on the one hand, and an individual's sociological role on the other hand. The highly volatile tension generated by the co-presence of the language of Atman and the language of Adhikara is reflected in the commentaries of Shankara, 8th century, whose Vedantic vision is known as non-duality or not-two-ness. So the claim is that while the empirical I, the jiva, is stamped with various social designations of varna, liberation from samsara involves the intuitive realization that the true Atman is non-dual with Brahman and transcends all sociological descriptions. Crucially, however, while the sage has surpassed all social distinctions, Shudras do not have the adhikara to undertake Vedic inquiry. It is almost as if Shankara is claiming that although the same white light pervades all reality, when it shines through certain types of social prisms, it loses the requisite luminosity. How does this complex set of declarations and negations work out in the micro negotiations of everyday life? So in a lecture or in an address with the title Vedanta and Privilege, Swami Vivekananda highlights this unstable conjunction of sociological gradualism on the one hand and spiritual equality on the other hand. If I ask one of our priests, do you believe in Vedanta? He says, that is my religion, I certainly do. Very well, do you admit the equality of all life? Certainly I do. The next moment when a low-caste man approaches this priest, he jumps to one side. Why did you jump? Because his very touch would have polluted me. But just now you were saying we are all the same, there is no difference. Oh, that is in theory only for householders. When I go to a forest, I will one day look upon everyone as the same. So the seemingly inconsistent, even blatantly contradictory combination of claims emerges from a worldview which is animated by the temporal arrow of karmic causation. The claim is that not everyone has the qualification in the here and now to view the world with spiritual equality. However, a very big if one patiently cultivates a way of life prescribed by one's guru and one's Vedantic lineage, then one will ascend across multiple lifetimes to the summit of this vision. Now, all of these ambiguities and inconsistencies reappear in the multiple visions of Hindu Bhakti. It would seem that Bhakti's suffused cosmological visions contain an egalitarian edge that can cut through caste-based claims based on occupational style, endogamous grouping, and ritual purity. Indeed, as we know, many figures who are connected with Bhakti-shaped universes are women and individuals from the lower end of the caste spectrum. However, one should not think in terms of one singular response on the part of all Bhakti animated visions regarding how devotional self-surrender to the Lord may interrogate or even undermine structural hierarchies. The hagiographies of Bhakti saints from the lower castes are sometimes ambivalent in their rejection of Brahminical privileges. Even as they claim that Bhakti transcends boundaries of caste, they may sometimes claim that some notions of caste purity and social hierarchy are crucial. So pre-modern movements associated with figures such as Chaitanya and Tulsidas and others can be regarded as social revolutions to the extent that the language of bhakti threatens the cultural prestige of Brahmin priests. However, this language did not, generally speaking, animate or call for a wholesale dissolution of social hierarchies. So to stick to this figure, Chaitanya, roughly the 15th century in present-day Bengal, Chaitanya was regarded as God who had descended to the world to rescue women and the lower castes. However, the movement was not concerned directly with socio-economic transformation or structural alteration of the ritual economy, but with the cultivation of hospitality to fellow Vaishnavas. The Chaitanya devotees usually accepted certain social restrictions relating to Varna Ashrama Dharma, such as devotees of different jatis not intermarrying or interdining. Thereby, they maintained, in the view of Joseph O'Connell, a combination of egalitarian affectivity with fellow devotees in settings such as festivals and non-egalitarian functionality in mundane, everyday, quotidian situations. So what that means is that such bhakti movements were often pulled back into Brahminical norms and subjectivities, for their primary focus lay not so much on directly erasing or effacing or dismantling caste-based distinctions, but on generating enclaves where socio-economic inequality or socio-cultural hierarchy would be regarded as irrelevant to the spiritual goal. Thus, rejections of Brahminical ritualism and authority sometimes proceeded alongside the redescription of one's quote-unquote Brahmin status in terms of one's deep devotion to the Lord. So the Bhagavata Purana declares that a dog eater, a socio-ritual outcast whose psycho-existential affectivities are dedicated to Vishnu, is superior to a real, sociologically speaking Brahmin who has turned away from Vishnu. In other places, however, the Bhagavata Purana defends the idealized classification of Varna Ashrama Dharma. In the South, Virashaiva theologians sometimes regarded Virashaivas as true Brahmins, whereas other Brahmins through birth alone are only natural Brahmins. So in short, the true devotee of the Lord, Vishnu or Shiva, is the quote-unquote true Brahmin. For a much more strident rejection of all terminologies and subjectivities of caste, we may turn to the songs of the Bauls, the wandering minstrels of Bengal and Bangladesh today. The Bauls, whose songs interweave various forms of Vaishnava bhakti, believe that the divine essence lies hidden in the person of the heart, Moner Manush, which is beyond all distinctions of caste, social mores, and cultural conventions. And Jane Openshaw argues that some Bauls have developed folk versions of Advaita Vedanta and directed the motive of non-dualism towards socio-economic themes. I have often heard even uninitiated rural Bengalis, Muslims as well as Hindus, explain non-dualism as non-differentiation and non-discrimination in a highly radical sense. The more conventionally religious would rarely draw such radical corollaries, of course, and I like that comment, of course. In other words, the more conventionally religious people may be familiar with some of the implications of non-dualism in terms of non-egocentricity, but such conventionally religious people would not pursue them to their socio-logical conclusion. Now, in this context, let me turn to a question that is sometimes put to me by my own students here in the faculty. Why is it so difficult to remove caste from Hindu sociocultural life? And I say, well, here is a very short answer to a difficult and a vexed question. Caste has both an epistemic or psychic or psychological dimension and a structural or material dimension. That is to say, one individual's subjective consciousness and the wider socio-economic location of caste. Knowledge is power, and forms of knowledge are densely embedded in structures of power. Let's say in this particular discussion setting on Zoom, nobody believes that a particular category of human beings is ritually impure. Even so, we cannot reconstruct at a single stroke the long-range socioeconomic asymmetries that we have received and which continue to shape our individual mentalities and social locations. In short, between psychic rewiring and systematic transformation, there is often a temporal lag. And because of this lag, it is so difficult to remove caste, and it remains a formidable challenge. Now, in about 5 minutes or 4 minutes, in conclusion, let me now return to the psychobiographical perspective I indicated at the beginning of the lecture. Over the years, I have found myself return to the question, what is the caste location of individuals with the surname Barua or Borua? A study of caste in Northeast India remains a relatively unexplored frontier for PhD students. Here in the northeastern frontiers of India, caste intersects densely with the categories of tribe, and that is quote-unquote tribe, you can have a whole discussion on tribe, religion, and social class. In Bangladesh, the surname Borua is generally used by Buddhists. In this land of Assam, Tripura, and West Bengal, it is used across a spectrum of caste locations and tribe affiliations. When I was a little boy, I spent a lot of time in the household of a Muslim friend of my mother. When I was around 15 years old, I met some people who were shocked to learn that I had been eating at the same table as Muslims. And I was surprised because my immediate family, as well as these individuals, belong to a lineage that was established by a 16th century Vaishnava guru called Sankaradeva or Hankordev, who was himself from a non-Brahmin family. When I started reading through the social history of Assamese Vaishnavism, I understood that the lineage embodies a deep fundamental conflict over the question of caste. So according to one sub-tradition, a follower of Vishnu has to renounce all Brahminical markers and subjectivities of social ritual purity. While according to the alternative view, such markers of Brahminical authority and purity are not only compatible with, but are even necessary for true devotion to Vishnu. So the debate relates to how to read a verse such as this one, composed by Hankordev's immediate disciple Madhavdev. I do not belong to the four jatis or the four ashramas. Surely, I am a servant, a das of the lotus feet of Krishna. Some Brahmin disciples of Hankordev Shankardeva read the master's message in terms of the language of Vedic ritual purity, commensality, and marrying within Varna or Jati. On the island of Majuli in Assam, which happens to be the world's largest riverine island, some of the Vaishnava monasteries have a strong Brahminical infusion, and the consumption of vegetarian food there becomes the central line of demarcation between the true devotee, that is to say the true Brahmin, and those other Vaishnavas from a lower caste or a quote-unquote tribal location. So it is this unfinished project of a promised equality that casts a long shadow on the present through its multiple interruptions. And I will stop there.
Thank you so much, Ankur. It was really fascinating to stop at the surname Barua, and I remember we having these conversations with you during our lunch meetings. So thank you very much again, Ananya, John, and Ankur. And Hope to see you soon again.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. Thank you. Bye.
Thank you for arranging this.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye, John. Bye, Ananya. Thank you so much.